Battlefield surprises have thrown the Americans for a loop. In recent days, the Iranians have shot down an American F-15 fighter jet with rescue crews scrambling to find the two survivors. One was found, the pilot. The navigator has not yet been found. And an A-10 Warthog airplane was reportedly shot down but managed to land safely, or at least its pilot did. I'm Borzou Daragahi. This is my newsletter podcast. It's called Badlands, and it's at borzou.substack.com. Please subscribe. Please support my work. Recently, I spoke with India's NewsX about the latest developments in Iran and what they mean for the ongoing war.
Joining us to discuss the ongoing conflict inside Iran is Borzou Daragahi, an Iranian-American journalist and the founder of the Badlands newsletter. He joins us live from Istanbul. Let's start off with the IRGC's air defenses. We know that the Americans have the most powerful air force in the world. How does the IRGC's ability to defend from those fighter jets fees against those highly technological American fighter jets and drones, etc.?
Not very well. The Iranians have been struggling for decades to improve their air defenses. There was a time, for example, when Iranians were just arguing constantly with the Russians to get some advanced air defense systems that they had ordered and paid for. But because the Russians were afraid of upsetting the Americans and the Israelis at that point, they wouldn't deliver them. That phase is over, and they did receive those air defenses. But in general, the Americans have been flying, just hundreds of sorties across the country, Israelis as well, and very few, perhaps 2 or 3, have been struck by Iranian air defenses.
And sir, in terms of Iran's current capabilities, I've just come from a conversation with Dr. Emmanuel Navon. He's based in Tel Aviv, and once again, the Israelis and the Americans are persisting on this narrative that Iran's missile capabilities have been severely degraded. What are your thoughts on this? We're getting contrasting reports.
Yeah, I heard a little bit of the last person who was talking, and he was just reading off the emails that they get every morning from the Israeli Foreign Ministry. And I've been on those lists as well, and he's just giving off the talking points. Israelis lie, Iranians lie, Americans lie. We can not really gain access to the truth, but I think that there are a few possibilities here, and that is that Iranians are not only continuing to launch these strikes, they keep launching salvos at kind of various rates. And it's not because necessarily that they're running out and they don't have the same level of missiles that they did last summer or earlier in the war. It could just be that they're preparing for a very long war. And if you look at the messaging coming out of Iran, it's a little bit frightening because it seems like they're preparing the population for possibly a war that lasts multiple, not weeks, not months, but years. And that is kind of where we're at with regard to the Iranians. There's also the possibility that in these missile cities that they have built inside mountains, these fortified missile launch bases that they have all over Iran. Iran is a very mountainous country, a very large country. They've also built missile and drone factories in there so that all they need to do is get some imported steel, aluminum, some parts from Russia, from the Caspian Sea, and continue to produce these missiles and drones as the war continues. I would not take anything that Israelis and the Americans are saying seriously about this. I wouldn't trust the Iranians either. But at this point, the Americans and the Israelis are dealing with restless populations that are like, hey, you said this was going to take 3 days, then 3 weeks. Now you're talking about maybe a couple months. Why is this taking so long? And so we're in a situation like in Vietnam where the generals just kept saying every week, don't worry about it, we'll have the boys home by Christmas. Well, months go by, years go by, and the wars continue. I would be very cautious about trusting officials in this particular situation.
And another thing, sir, I do want to talk about that coalition, the Americans and the Israelis. A lot of analysts are saying that these two sides have different aims here. It was always at the forefront of Donald Trump's agenda to stop Iran developing a nuclear weapon. These were the negotiations that were happening when this war of choice was started. And as well, however, Israelis, with the Israelis, regime change has been the top of the agenda, according to a lot of the experts that I speak to as well. So there is a divide in the tops of these aims here. Donald Trump yesterday has said regime change has already been achieved. Do you agree with that? Do you think the Israelis agree with that? Can we see, do you think we're seeing a possible fracture in that coalition when it comes to ending this conflict?
Well, I think the Israelis have very different goals in mind. As you can tell when you listen to their messaging and their spokespeople, there's a real kind of hatred there for not just the Islamic Republic, but for the threat that Iran poses. And there's a real nihilistic annihilation kind of talk. And they wouldn't mind if, Iran is just completely destroyed as a state, not just the Islamic Republic, not regime change, but regime annihilation, system annihilation. Afghanistan, they've made that quite clear. They use the term, they talk about Iranians being kind of religious fanatics. They keep using the term Amalek, which is this very kind of biblical term referring to a group of people whom the Jews were commanded by God to not just kill the people, but the children and the animals as well. Not to just capture the children and the animals, but to kill them as well. And that is how Israel views this conflict. But America, they're on a different wavelength every day. And so they're just being kind of led along by the Israeli agenda because they have no agenda. They thought it was going to be a 3-day war. That was plan A. There was no plan B. And so now they're just sort of stuck in this quagmire where if they basically call it quits and leave, Iran is more powerful than it was before the war because they control the Strait of Hormuz. And if they continue, it will turn into another Vietnam. And I think a lot of American analysts and the American public see that.
And finally, in terms of the U.S. rhetoric today, and the U.S. rhetoric at the start of this year, when those protests in Iran were at their height, two completely conflicting stances. Donald Trump at the start of this year said help was on its way for those people of Iran. Now he is threatening to destroy Iran's bridges, to destroy its electric power plants, infrastructure which, of course, will affect millions of people around Iran if it is destroyed. What are your thoughts on that messaging coming out of the White House today?
Yeah, he said bomb them back into the Stone Age, which is what the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, also said, bomb them back to the Stone Age. Look, that is war crime behavior and rhetoric, and that is really low of the Americans. I know a lot of American people in the military and armed forces messaging me saying they're really ashamed of such talk. Don't confuse our military ethics with what these two clowns are saying. But this is not I've always contended that this particular Trump administration and this particular Israeli government doesn't really care about the Iranian people. The protests were just a fig leaf to put like a minor humanitarian a cover over what was always going to be a war of imperial conquest and destruction. And that is not working out the way they wanted it to. So there's a lot of frustration there.
Finally, and this is slightly off topic, but sure. In terms of the Iranian American diaspora, we're seeing Lion and Sun flags all around these conservative gatherings. CPAC, for example, has just occurred in the United States. We're seeing constant American Iranians coming on and speaking and wanting to keep this war going. Borzu, what has been your experience with the Iranian American diaspora at the moment? What's the consensus among them?
I don't think there is a consensus. There's a lot of division. There are some people like that. There was a poll done at the beginning of the conflict of Iranian Americans, and it was about 50-50 in favor and in support of the war. There is a very loud, vocal, well-connected, well-funded minority of monarchists who seem to drown out the other voices. But now, just recently, a couple days ago, that same organization did another poll, and it was more like 66-33 in terms of the opinion of the diaspora communities about this war. And that's because they see like schools being bombed, hospitals being bombed, vaccine factories being hit, this bridge, this obvious civilian bridge being struck just the other day, and the kind of rhetoric coming out of the White House and the Pentagon. That's not very encouraging. It doesn't seem like this is a war for Iran. It seems like it's a war more and more against Iran. This has been the latest edition of the Badlands podcast. I am Borzu Dergahi. I'm a journalist. You can subscribe to my newsletter and get more content like this at borzu.substack.com. Thank you.